I feel honoured to be invited to speak here at the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Cybernetics Society in the holy year of 1968. On such an auspicious anniversary, it seems appropriate to look back at the historical development of cybernetics, especially here in Britain, which is what I'll try to do. I'll try to keep it relatively brief because I've talked about this history before and because I'd like to leave time for questions. Of course, cybernetics in Britain was a many-splendid thing, but I want to focus our attention on what I personally take to be the most radical and politically promising developments, which I associate with the work of Grey Walter, Ross Ashby, Stafford Beer and Gordon Pask, also Gregory Bateson and Ronald Lang. My hope is that remembering this history might help invigorate cybernetics' future, and I'd be very interested to know what people think of that. The argument is that cybernetics was and still is significant and important because it represents a different paradigm, in Thomas Kuhn's sense, from the more familiar modern sciences like physics. Cybernetics is a different blueprint for thinking about and acting in the world from what we teach generally in schools and universities, and that's what makes it important. It's another way of being in the world. We can think about this from three angles. First about ontology, then about practical projects, and finally about selves. So, the most fundamental distinction between cybernetics and the other sciences is to be found at the level of ontology, by which I mean broad brush visions of what the world is like, what sort of a place it is. That's what ontology is about. Modern sciences like physics assume that we live in a knowable world, dualistically split off from humanity, and they take it as their job to produce positive knowledge of that world. Newton's laws of motion, say, or string theory, as fundamental descriptions of the fixed furniture of the world. That's what the modern sciences are about, what they do. In 1959, Stafford Beer defined cybernetics, in contrast, as the science of what he called exceedingly complex systems, entities which we can never fully know and which can always surprise us. So that cybernetics was and is, on this definition, a science of the unknowable. For me, this change in worldview or ontology from knowability to unknowability is the key thing. Knowability is what we've all grown up with, what we've all been taught. So unknowability has to appear as an outrageous proposition, exceedingly hard to get to grips with. And perhaps that's why it seems to be edited out of contemporary understandings of what cybernetics is. But I want to put it back in. The next point I want to dwell on is that ontology makes a difference. My idea here is that different sorts of practices and projects, different ways of going on, hang together with different images of what the world is like. If we live in a knowable world, we can dominate it through knowledge. So our characteristic way of being in the world is command and control. Dictating terms to nature or other people. And this, I think, is how we usually go on. It's the general pattern of behavior in the world. we take this command and control stance for granted. It's very hard to think of another way of being in the world. If, on the other hand, the world is ultimately unknowable, we have to find some other pattern of behavior, which must, in the end, I think, amount to performative experimentation. Simply trying this, trying that, finding out what will happen next, and adapting to what comes back. This sort of experimentalism is indeed what I associate with the more interesting adventures in the history of cybernetics. These odd and fascinating projects go with cybernetics' odd and fascinating ontology. And I now want to explore a few examples of historical cybernetic projects to clarify what I'm talking about and what's at stake here. We can start with a couple of machines built in 1948, the Tortoise and the Homeostat. Gray Walter's Tortoise was a little robot that wandered around looking for lights, locking onto them, and then getting bored and wandering away again. That's Gray Walter, his wife, Vivian Dovey. They have two children, one is electronic, that's the human child, no, famous picture of the tortoise, the cyborg family. That's the working components of the tortoise. This is the circuit diagram, if anybody can read these things. And that's 2 minutes in the life of a tortoise. It's a kind of time delay, famous time delay photo. Bumps into an obstacle, goes around it, locates the light, gets dazzled, and wanders off again. The important thing about the tortoise, for my purposes today, is that in contrast to AI robotics, familiar kinds of robotics, it had no inner representation of its world. It lived, so to speak, in the thick of things, continually finding out about a world that was literally unknowable to it. This is the sense in which the tortoise staged and acted out what I call the cybernetic ontology, and it acted out that ontology as engineering. To get the hang of the cybernetic ontology, just think of the world as made up not of predictable quarks, but of lively and interacting tortoises like that. And in case we don't take the tortoise seriously enough, we could remember that it was the direct ancestor of today's situated robotics, as pioneered by people like Rodney Brooks at MIT. Important things flowed from the tortoise. Ross Ashby's Homeostat also explored and adapted to its world, but in a different way from the tortoise. That's Ross Ashby in the mid-1950s. That's a picture actually 4 interconnected homeostats. That's the wiring diagram of the homeostat. That's Stafford Beer. I haven't got to him yet. Walter's tortoise, the tortoise explored physical space, while the homeostat explored the space of its own performances. Its object was to come into equilibrium with its environment, which was modeled by other homeostats. So if you focus on this homeostat, the other 3 represent its environment. They're all interconnected electrically. The object of the homeostat, what it did, was to come into equilibrium with its environment, which is modeled by these homeostats, by electrically provoking the environment, the outputs, and reconfiguring itself in response to the signals that came back. If the currents flowing between the homeostats exceeded some limit, a stepping switch would move to the next position, changing the resistance or polarity of the circuit, and this process would be repeated again and again. The switch would move, until all the currents tended to zero and equilibrium was reached. The switch is the U there, uniselectors. Again, this finding equilibrium was a purely performative achievement. Like the tortoise, the homeostat contained no inner representations of its world. Again, the homeostat was a wonderful example of what I call ontological theatre, a little non-dualist, non-modern model of an entity experimenting in and reacting to a lively world it could never know. And the contrast between conventional representational AI and tortoises and homeostats illustrates very nicely the idea that ontology makes a difference. If you have an ontology of knowability, you do representational AI. Unknowability leads to tortoises and homeostats. Illustrates the idea that ontology makes a difference and that cybernetics was a different paradigm in practice as well as in the realm of ideas. It was a different way to do robotics. Much of British cybernetics grew out of the homeostat in particular, and we can look at a few examples of how this went now. Starting with Stafford Beer. There's Beer in the mid-1960s. Beer was a close friend of Ashby, as well as being an honorary fellow of the Cybernetics Society. Much of Beer's so-called management cybernetics grew straight out of the homeostat. Ashby regarded the homeostat as a primitive electromechanical brain, and Beer therefore reckoned that any adaptive system was in some sense brain-like. In collaboration with Gordon Pask, Beer took this idea to the limit in the late 50s and early 60s by experimenting with naturally occurring adaptive biological systems like pond ecosystems as cybernetic controllers, managers of factories. Take away the human managers and stick in a pond was Beer's idea, or something like that. The hope was that the pond, the factory, and the economic environment could find some stable configuration in flipping through possible states, just like an array of homeostats. This so-called biological computing project failed, alas. We don't have ponds managing factories. And in the 1960s, Beer moved on to his biologically inspired viable system model of organizations. I don't want to say much about the VSM today because Raul Espejo is here somewhere, and he's the world expert on the VSM. Maybe he'll talk about it this afternoon. But I just want to note that the hallmark of the VSM as a diagram of organizational structure was always homeostat-like negotiations between different levels of the organization, running from higher management through planning to the level of production. So this is the VSM analogy between the body and the nervous system as the control system and the viable organization as Beer conceived it. These are the different levels of the organization, 5, 4, 3, this is a 2 and a 1. And these arrows going up and down indicate homeostat-like reconfigurations looking for equilibrium. The idea was that the levels would communicate with one another through a process of proposal and counter-proposal until a shared equilibrium was reached over specific plans for action. This seems like an entirely reasonable way to manage an organization to me, but I just want to emphasize how different it is from conventional management, in which commands flowed down from above to the lower levels and nothing much goes back up. as found, for example, as we all know, in British University. British University are classic examples of command and control management, which is what makes things like the VSM so interesting. Rather than say any more about Beer, I want to move from engineering and management to the arts and to another of Beer's friends, Gordon Pask, who was, amongst many distinctions, the second chairman of the Cybernetics Society between 1976 and 1979. That's the formal diagram of the viable system model. Oh, that's the control room of the Project Cybersign, which I guess everybody knows about, which tried to implement the VSM in Chile in the early 1970s. Such a nice picture, I have to keep it here. That's Gordon Pask. Pask's life work centered on systems of humans and machines that somehow staged homeostat-like, open-ended interactions with one another. And we can start with a machine called Musicolor, which Pask built in the early 1950s when he was still an undergraduate at Cambridge. Musicolor was a device that used a musical performance to control a light show. The sounds would control the visuals. That's the only picture I know of Musicolor. There's the hardware on the left and the top. And this is lights being projected on a sheet on a stage. What you really need is the sound and the movement, but haven't got it. The sounds would control the visuals. Simple enough, except that Musicolor's key feature was that the machine adapted to the performances in real time. Thresholds for lighting effects would rise as notes or sequences were repeated, so that eventually the machine would get bored, as Pask put it, and cease to respond, thus encouraging the human performer to adapt in turn to the machine by trying something new. The adaptation thus went both ways, back and forth between the performer and the machine, each stimulating and reacting to the other, just like two homeostats searching for a collective equilibrium. Once more, we can think of a Musicolor performance as a beautiful piece of ontological theatre, staging the basic cybernetic ontology of unknowability and performative experimentation, now as a kind of artwork. The difference between Musicolor and conventional artworks is also obvious. I don't even know what to compare something like this with in the conventional art world. It's clear once again here that ontology makes a difference. You go on differently if you have a different view of what the world is like. Much of Pask's later work staged variations on Musicolor. He worked with the radical playwright Joan Littlewood to develop an interactive theatre in which feedback loops enable the audience to steer the action on stage in different directions at key moments. A very different arrangement from the usual passive witnessing of conventional theatre. Oh, that's the logic diagram of Musicolor. That's the logic diagram of the cybernetic theatre with feedback loops between the audience and the performer. Pask's robot sculpture, The Colloquy of Mobiles, which featured in the Cybernetic Serendipity exhibition at the ICA in 1968, was an array of interacting robots, designated male and female, which staged dances of agency with one another. That's a classic picture of the setup of the robots at the ICA in 1968. These blousy figures, the balloons are the females, and these are little angular males, and they're all communicating with sounds and lights, trying to reflect the lights off the males back to the females. Interestingly, a chap called Paul Pangoro has been recreating the colloquy of mobiles in Detroit. In fact, it looks like this at this very moment. As I understand, it's actually kind of working and mimicking what the original colloquy did 50 years ago. It'd be great to go and see it. Where are we? Oh yeah, right. The colloquy in turn became the model for a whole tradition of interactive artworks up to the present, and the contrast with conventional art forms such as sculpture and painting is again obvious. If the colloquy shows us a world of lively performative experimentation, all these robots are trying to adapt to one another at the same time. Conventional art, in contrast, conjures up instead a dualist arrangement of active human viewers contemplating a fixed world of lifeless objects. I should also mention Pasque's contribution to architecture in the so-called Fun Palace, another of Joan Littlewood's projects, which was a large public building in London that was planned out in great detail in the early 1960s, but never quite got built. We usually think of buildings as fixed entities, like this one, designed for specific functions: homes, schools, universities, prisons. In contrast, the designers of the Fun Palace insisted they could not know its function in advance. The Fun Palace was thus designed to explore the unknown by supporting a multiplicity of uses: education, sport, theatre, the arts, and to be reconfigurable in use. It was intended to change shape over time, according to the uses that people found for it. And Pasque's distinctive contribution to the project was, again, to devise a control system that would get bored along the lines of Musicolor. Instead of simply going along with current patterns of use, the building would sometimes find some other way to behave, thus inviting its human users to take advantage of novel opportunities to find their own new ways to go on. It's a kind of, what do you call it, cross-section of the Fun Palace with all sorts of movable elements, big crane over the top for shifting things around. This is Pasque's diagram of the control system. The interesting thing is this box here, which has output of modified people. Some people think that means some horrible social engineering, but I think it means the building is inviting people to become something new and different from what they were when they came in. That was the real object of the Fun Palace. So here then, the entire assemblage of building and users acted out a version of Ashby's multi-homeostat setup in an open-ended dance, collectively arriving at some mutual equilibrium, at least for a time. This was the sense in which the Fun Palace was an example of distinctively cybernetic architecture and can function as ontological theatre, at once exemplifying the cybernetic ontology of unknowability and performative adaptation, and staging it in the real world, now in the form of a building. The Fun Palace, again, was the inspiration for a tradition of dynamic and interactive architecture that's very important today, though on a smaller and more domesticated scale. I think I left in another couple of pictures. Here's some more interactive experimental architecture from the Archie Graham group in the early 1960s in London. The moving city that, if it doesn't get on with its environment, develops legs and walks away somewhere else. The plug-in city full of reconfigurable bits. The plug-in city was a bit like the Fun Palace, except at the level of a city rather than a building. What all of these examples that I've mentioned show is, I hope, that cybernetics wasn't just a radically different way of thinking, but also of acting, of behaving. The cybernetic ontology hangs together with all sorts of strange and imaginative projects, from robotics to architecture, which are all systematically different from their conventional counterparts, inasmuch as they thematize experimentation and adaptation rather than command and control. So I think there's a new practical politics, a politics of practice and patterns of action that's at stake here in the shift from the modern worldview to cybernetics. Okay, I want to change tack now and think about another aspect of the history of British cybernetics. The question, what does it mean to be human, is much in the air today. And it interests me a lot that the cyberneticians had a much more imaginative and wider and wilder conception of what people are like than fields like AI, for example. The paradigmatic human for AI was the rational thinker. In the mid-1950s, for example, Newell and Simon's pioneering computer program, logic theorist, tried to prove theorems from Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica. AI these days focuses more on pattern recognition, of course, distinguishing photos of dogs from cats, say, or recognizing faces. We could say that conventional AI all along has modeled a modern philosophical image of man. It's tried to repeat as engineering a being who can see straight and reason about what he or she says. And that's all they can do. A very circumscribed range of performances. Cybernetics went much further in its conception of the human. The origins of cybernetics, especially in Britain, lay in psychiatry. Both Gray Walter and Ross Ashby worked in psychiatric establishments. And both were concerned not just with sanity and reasoning, but also with the irrational, madness. The first thing Walter did with his tortoises was drive them mad by cross-conditioning them to sounds and lights, reduce them to trembling wrecks. And then he would kill them by processes he analogized to sleep, electroshock, and lobotomy. Blast the circuits with current is a good way of straightening out their behavior, it turned out. Ashby, in turn, understood electroshock treatment by analogy, to repeatedly blasting a homeostat in one way or another to induce it to flip states until it arrived at some configuration resembling normality. So at one point, Ashby fantasizes about what he called blitz therapy, which was to give people LSD and then hypnotize them and then give them electroshock treatment, all in one go. This wasn't a very nice version of psychiatry by any means. That's how people used to go on in the 1950s. But it illustrates my point that the cyberneticians had a very broad conception of the human, running here from sanity to madness. Beer's favorite examples of exceedingly complex systems were the firm, the economy, and the brain. And early cybernetics aimed to explore what the brain can do, a long way beyond logical thought and reasoning. Walter's specialty, for example, was in epilepsy research, mapping the electrical correlates of epilepsy in the brain. At the opposite pole from madness lie spirituality and ecstasy. And the cyberneticians, especially the British ones, I think, were very much interested in these too. In his book, The Living Brain, Walter talked about the strange powers of Eastern yogi, like suspending the breath and stopping the heartbeat, and the achievement of nirvana, as interesting examples of what people could do, part of what it was to be human. In the mid-1940s, his research on epilepsy spilled over into research into the dynamic geometrical visions and hallucinations induced by staring into stroboscopes, research which was in turn picked up in the 1950s by William Burroughs and the Beats, poets and artists, leading straight to Brian Geison's dream machines, which are now available for purchase on the web, as well as to present-day giant stroboscopic artworks. So this is William Burroughs and his pal Brian Geison staring into a homemade strobe, right? It's a piece of cardboard with cutouts, a light bulb in the middle. It's going around on a record turntable. Geison said, this is the only piece of art that you can see all the world's artistic achievements with your eyes closed. You have to have your eyes closed to get the full effect of the strobe. This is a kind of contemporary artwork called Citadel by Matthias Munich. You have to imagine it strobing through all sorts of frequencies and colors. I think I'm standing over here somewhere, and I remember it because I was standing by the door. I was so terrified by this thing. The awful subsonic sounds. I just wanted to be able to run out. But anyway, that's a direct descendant of Gray Walter's epilepsy research. The contrast between strobe visions as a topic for cybernetics and face recognition as a central concern for present-day AI is striking, I hope. The former explores the unknown, while the latter tries to mechanize AI, the already known. And this sort of interest in altered states, performances, non-standard spiritualities, runs, whether we like it or not, right through the history of cybernetics, especially here in Britain. At different times, Ross Ashby declared himself to be an old-fashioned spiritualist and then a time worshipper, while Gordon Pask, the second president of the Cybernetics Society, wrote spiritualist detective stories, and he was interested, I think, in theories of universal mind, coming straight from Aldous Huxley, which individual minds kind of tap into, like radio sets. Beer, of course, studied and taught tantric yoga. That's what he looked like after the failure of the Chili Project. This is Beer the guru. There he is meditating with a rock. That's one of his diagrams, the theory of recursive consciousness, running from the neuron through the brain to the cosmos. They came from his book Beyond Dispute in 1994. In the 1950s, another eminent British cybernetician, Gregory Bateson, this chap, followed Aldous Huxley in connecting madness and Eastern spirituality, seeing schizophrenia as a confused form of Buddhist enlightenment, precipitated by what Bateson famously called double binds, in which patterns of communication got locked into a kind of bad oscillation. Psychosis, on Bateson's account, was a desperate attempt to escape from these oscillations by flipping into a radically altered state. Bateson's ideas were famously and notoriously put into practice in the 1960s by a group of psychiatrists led by R.D. Laing, there's the man, at a large house called Kingsley Hall here in London. Kingsley Hall was a commune in which psychiatrists and the mad, as well as artists and dancers, lived together. In contrast to conventional mental hospitals, Kingsley Hall was a non-hierarchic institution, echoing Beer's viable system model in this respect. The psychiatrists didn't prescribe drugs or electroshock or try to normalize the mad people in any way. The aim was simply to provide a place where the inner voyages of sufferers could find sympathetic support and possibly come to a successful conclusion. And importantly, there was no recipe for what that support at Kingsley Hall should look like. The model was again a homeostat-like adaptation of the sane and the mad, a sort of open-ended and performative latching on. One of the therapists, Joe Burke, for example, found that animal games of fighting and biting helped with Mary Barnes, who was Kingsley Hall's great success story. And on the model of symmetrically adapting homeostats, the idea was that the selves of the psychiatrists might also be transformed in this process. Kingsley Hall, as Laing once put it, was a place where the mad could teach the sane to go mad. Like the Fun Palace, but in a more intense and deliberate form, Kingsley Hall was intended as a space of experimentation and emergence for new human possibilities. New kinds of self, a process quite unimaginable from the perspective of mainstream AI, modern philosophy, the contemporary social sciences, or even Western common sense. This is what I'm saying that cybernetics offered a much broader and richer answer to the question, what does it mean to be human, than any of our usual ways of thinking. I've come to the end of my historical examples, and I want to just spend a couple of minutes, if I can, wrapping things up. I've been trying to show that cybernetics wasn't just any old science that flourished for a while and then kind of faded away. The branch of British cybernetics I've been talking about is especially significant and important because it's a different paradigm, a different way of thinking and acting in the world from what we teach our children. And I've been trying to put some flesh on that idea from three angles. I've talked about ontology and the ontology of unknowability. Then the fact that ontology can make a difference in practice. Now about the expanse of the human and the self that goes with the ontology of exceedingly complex systems. So the last thing I need to think about is why this is my account. Why this account of the singularity of cybernetics seems not to be shared by everyone. Why doesn't everyone understand the history and substance of cybernetics this way? What's happened to cybernetics as I've just described it? I can think of a few answers to those questions. First, I've tried to locate the singularity of cybernetics in its ontology. And it has become apparent to me over the years that the word ontology is a bit of a deterrent to many people. I'm not sure why that should be, except that it's the other side of the obsession of 20th century philosophy with epistemology, with knowledge and theories of how we produce knowledge, rather than a concern with how the world is. The cyberneticians, I have to admit, themselves barely if ever used the word ontology, but they were faithful to their academic milieu, and whenever they wanted to talk about anything philosophical, they said epistemology. That's the word they always used. Bateson was quite a villain here. He conjured up beautiful ontological visions of uncontrollable worlds. He talked about negotiating with ecosystems as being like trying to reverse a truck with two trailers, something absolutely impossible and uncontrollable. But then he called what he was talking about epistemology. Right? So we're stuck with this. Well, the history of cybernetics is stuck with this word epistemology, but it could do with ontology. What about the concrete practices and artifacts I've been talking about? They seem to have been just abandoned and forgotten by contemporary cyberneticians. Pasque, for example, is largely remembered as the originator of conversation theory, not the builder of fabulous robot artworks or fun palaces. The history of cybernetics seems to have been dematerialized. What about the concrete practices and artifacts I've been talking about? They seem to have just been abandoned and forgotten by contemporary cyberneticians. Pasque, for example, is largely remembered as the originator of conversation theory, not the builder of robot artworks and fun palaces. The history of cybernetics has been dematerialized, one could say, and an integral part of that dematerialization has been an emphasis on so-called second-order cybernetics, with its focus on the situatedness and the ethical responsibility of the observer, classic epistemological, not ontological, concerns. From another angle, we could say that the practices and projects I've been talking about have been stolen. Actually, as I said, situated robotics, say, and interactive architecture, even biological computing and anti-psychiatry are alive and well in the world, but now they belong to their own specialist fields, much bigger and better funded than anything cybernetic. I don't know why cybernetics doesn't try to claim them back by inviting people from those fields to speak at conferences like this one. It will be a great idea. I'm sure a lot of them would be keen to come. It will be like the legendary interdisciplinary Macy conferences all over again, and it would paint a great picture for the future of cybernetics. Last, what about the expanded cybernetic vision of what it means to be human, and the altered states, strange performances, and non-standard spiritualities that go along with that? All I can say here is that this vision has always been repressed and marginalized, hidden in the shadows of cybernetics, something the historian has to dig out. Only Stafford Beer talked about spirituality openly, and most of his friends and colleagues wished he hadn't. The key point is probably that all the weight of modernity tends to enforce a very narrow version of the human as simply a rational, calculating actor, so that, conversely, modernity, and more precisely neoliberalism, is threatened by anything richer. Lang and his friend Alexander Trocky at one point imagined a sort of institutional meso-revolution spilling outwards from Kingsley Hall to outflank the established order. This is why it's so hard to go beyond narrow visions of the human in public. But it might also be why it's important politically to try, and recovering the history of cybernetics is one way to do that. Thank you.